All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. All right, wonderful. Well, so let's begin by thanking our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar. Stephen Tarizin for dedicating all of his Sherman Drushos this month in memory of Tari's father, Dr. Harry Khan, Tzvi Hirsch, Ben Yosef HaKohen. To thank Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating the Sherman Drushos this month in memory of Paul's grandfather, Zechariah Ben Zechariah, and grandmother Dina Bas Dov. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, anonymous sponsorship, Leilui Nishmas Moshe Aaron Alter, Ben Yosef Binyamin, on the occasion of his first yard site, and Leilui Nishmas Sarah Dina Bas Elimelech. And to thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Siman Seid Haken, for dedicating the learning in all of the tragic carbonos of Klal Yisrael this past week. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, their neshamas will have an aliyah, and the merit of Hashem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, will usher in an eternal period of peace and shalom for Klal Yisrael and for all mankind. So with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Lamed Tes 39. We are picking up in merit Hashem on Lamed Ches Amud Beis 38b, and we are picking up Amali Ravina Merkaz Ravashi, right? 3 lines are from the bottom. So just to reorient ourselves a little bit, if you remember again, we had an interesting statement, or machlok sin Abaye and Rava. So Abaye said as follows: if a person eats a chartzon, we'll go with the definition of chartzon being a grape skin. Person goes ahead and eats, grape seed. Person eats a grape seed, they're lokeshnaim. Person gets 2 sets of malchus. Why 2 sets of malchus? 1, for the specific prohibition of eating a grape seed, and number 2, for the general prohibition of mikol, right, anything that comes from the vine. Mikol asher yaseh migefen hayayin. So this is a bayishita that in general, anything, in other words, any prohibition that the Nazir is over, he's almost always inevitably going to be over on 2 isurim, 1 the specific isur, and 1 the general isur. Rava disagreed with this because Rava went ahead and said, "Inlokin alav shebechlalos." You can't get malchus on a general lav. General lav, fine. Rav Papa raised a kasha on Abaye, and Rav Papa pointed out the case, ultimately again, of a Nazir who went ahead and violated multiple things, right? And if you notice again, the Brisa only gave him liability for 5 sets of malchus. 5 sets of malchus. So Rav Papa essentially says to Abaye, if you're right, he really should have gotten what? Malchus, 6 sets of malchus. Why 6? 5 for the specific prohibitions that he violated, and a 6th for the general prohibition of Mikol Shariaseh Megef and Hayayin. The fact that there's only 5 and not 6 indicates to us, says Rav Papa, that Abaye, you're wrong. Abaye counters, right? The Gemara says, ton of a shear. No. When the Brisa says 5, the Brisa didn't include all of the things for which you're liable for. So Rabbi says, so now we're trying to figure out, in order to make the claim of ton of a shear, you have to identify at least 2 things, right, that the Tana left off. So one of them could be the lav shebechlalos, but what's the other thing? To which the Gemara says, Ravashi, V'hashir de bein habeinayim. So Rabbi said, this is very interesting. But the Brisa left off. Rabbi said, bein habeinayim. Listen to this. Here's what we've established, right? If a Nazir eats a grape, Rabbi said, right, what are you chayiv for in a grape? So what have we established? You're chayiv for zug, grape skin. You're chayiv for chartzanim, grape seeds. What else are you chayiv for? Everything between the skin and the seeds. That's called the bein habeinayim. Right, like the meat of the grape. So I will say, if you take a quick look at the Rush says as follows. The Rush says, "Hashir de bein habeinayim, hainu mashi yesh bein chartzanim vazag." So I will say, the part of the grape, it's so interesting that we've been focusing on the seeds and the seeds and the skins. So the stuff that is between the seeds and the skin, kidepar shleil, v'lo ke'alav mishum v'ad. Now the truth is, there's an additional prohibition. So what's really fascinating about say is, if you eat a whole grape, it sounds like, what are you chayiv for? It's incredible. What are you chayiv? Right? You're chayiv for zug, grape skins. You're chayiv for bein habeinayim, the flesh. You're chayiv for chatzanim, the seeds. I say, by the way, all one little grape. right? One little grape. Now let's say all these different prohibitions associated with it. So the Gemara says, that's not in the Brisa. That's not in the Brisa. Amra Papa, lo tanya midi chamish. So Papa says, you know what? The truth is, I recant. I retract, right? Don't say that the Brisa said you're chayiv 5 times. So Gemara says, what's going on over here? Vaha, top of Lamates, Vaha, os vechamish. But that was the whole point. In other words, Rav Papa's whole kasha on Abaye was that the Brisa said you only get 5 sets of, not only, you get 5 sets of malchus. That was, Rav Papa's entire kasha was based on the number that the Brisa gave, and the Brisa seemingly omits the lav shebechlalos. My time osve. So I'll say if the Brisa is not going to have the number 5, which is the whole kunz of the kasha, then what's the kasha that Rav Papa is bringing? So we'll listen to this. Rav Papa says, Ana savri lav gimari hi biadei. So I will say, Rav Papa said, the reason I questioned Abaye was because I did not think that Abaye had a true tradition, a Gemara, from his Rebbe about his position. However, v'haderbe, right? V'lo yedana the Gemara hi biadei v'lo haderbe. I originally thought that when I posed my question to Abaye didn't really possess a sincere tradition about this from his Rebbe, and therefore, when confronted with the Brisa, he would retract. But now that I realize that Abaye does have a true Gemara, a true Masorah, ultimately again for his position, I retract my question. Fine. So if I will say, the way the Gemara essentially ends off is with a more yesodistic machlokes in Abaye and Rava, namely, do you get malchus on a lav shebichlalos? So do you get malchus on a general lav? And again, at least we're going to keep hyper focused on Nazir. So I will say that's a big ramification, because what that would mean is when you violate a tenet of Naziros, how many sets of malchus do you get? So at least again, so we'll say. So I'll point out, by the way, this goes on both ends, right? So in general, again, is it mean if you eat a grape, you're going to get a machlok, you're going to get malchus for whatever part of the grape you ate, plus from mikol asher yaseh migefen hayayin, or not. So Abaye says you will, lokin alav shebechlalos. Rava says, in lokin alav shebechlalos. Shabbos says, so what's interesting is the Rambam in Hilchos Naziros, Perek Hey Halacha Ches, writes as follows. He says, Nazir sha'achol kizayis anovim, kizayis chartzon, kizayis zog, kizayis simukim. So he talks about over here, if a Nazir ate a whole bunch of stuff, right? He ate a kizayis of grapes, a kizayis of grape seeds, a kizayis of grape skins, a kizayis of raisins, a revius of wine, all these different things. He gets malchus for every single thing that he did. Right? So you'll get malchus for grape skins, you'll get malchus for grape seeds, you'll get malchus for grape busser, right? You'll get malchus for everything. For everything. Makes sense? Because they're each articulated as an independent lav. Shekol echad mehen belav echadu. So listen to this. Now, look at the Rambam writes. He says, Veloke malchus shishis. Watch this. The Rambam says, you'll get a 6th set of malchus. Why? Mishum Lo Yachel Devaro. Fascinating. So Rabbi say the Rambam holds like Rava over here in this case, namely that Mikol Asher Yaseh Gefen Hayayin is not an additional lav. But the Rambam does hold, and this is fascinating, that if you violate your Nazirus, you're going to get malchus for whatever the particular infraction, plus the fact that you're in violation of Lo Yachel Devaro. What does Lo Yachel Devaro say? What does Yachel Devaro? Don't profane your word. Now, where is that stated? By Nedarim, right? So, by the way, according to the Rambam, you're going to get that lav, you're going to be in violation of that whenever you violate your neder. That's not unique to Nazirus. What he's just pointing out is that halacha lamaisa, whenever you're in violation of your Nazirus, you're also in violation of lo yachal dvar. It's a real Musar Haskell if you think about it, that there's a lot written in the Sifrei Musar about the psychology of chait. Why do people sin? Okay, so it's easy to say, gaiva, taiva, kavod, right? Gaiva, everything is about me. I just want to make I'm a pleasure-seeking person because it's all about my happiness and comfort. Taiva, I can't resist my temptations. And kavod, which is kind of the same thing as gaiva, right? So I'll say, but what's very interesting is, if you believe the concept that people are good at their core, which is what we believe, I want to do the right thing, so why is it that I commit averos? Why is it? I will say, I think deep down, it's often because we think that our actions don't matter. In other words, I'll do this, and it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. In other words, whatever the effects are, they're going to be localized, and there's not going to be any type of ripple effect or ramification. Anything I do doesn't really matter. And I will say what's fascinating to me is like you see a Rambam like this. And what is the Rambam saying? Here's one little act. And look how one little act has ripple effects, right? See here, I'm a Nazir. I violated the tenet of my Naziros. Okay, fine, right? So I will say, you know how it is. Sometimes you just have to have that grape, right? Sometimes, no matter what ramifications are, you just can't hold back. What's fascinating is the Rambam says, yeah, by the way, but it's not just about the grape. It's not just about the grape. There are also other ramifications. Lo yachal dvaro. I will say, if we condition ourselves to think that kind of like throwing the rock into the pond, that there's a ripple effect that comes out, every single thing we do, there's a ripple effect. When a person commits an Avera, says the Rambam, it's not localized. It's not the pshat that it's just you and that's it. There's a ripple effect that goes out. And what that ripple effect is, who knows? Now, the beautiful thing is, whatever is true with Avera is true 100 times over with a mitzvah. Same thing, I would say. Often we don't seize our opportunities to do mitzvahs because we don't necessarily think that they matter all that much. But if an Avera has a ripple effect, you're not only chayiv for Naziros, but you're chayiv for lo yachal dvaro. If it's true l'ra, then it's certainly true l'tov. If we take advantage of our opportunities, the impact that positive things, that mitzvahs, Talmud Torah, chesed, it's not just on us, but the ripple effect it has on our family, the ripple effect that it has on our community, the ripple effect it has on Klal Yisrael is just as dramatic as well. Incredible. Let's go weiter. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer, Amar Rav Yosef, remember again, the last machlokes in the Mishnah was, what's the definition of chartzanim and zag? So remember again, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, chartzanim are grape skins, zag is grape seeds. Rabbi Yossi said, chartzanim are grape seeds, and zog are grape skins. Am Rabbi Yosef, Kiman, Metargeminan, Mi Purtsanin ad Itzur. And so I will say Unkelos on the pasuk of Chartsanim ad Zag. How does Unkelos translate Chartsanim ad Zag? Literally, Mi Purtsanin ad Itzurin. What's the definition? I will say Purtsanin means like Pnimius, the inner part. Itzuran means the outer part. So I will say, in accordance with who does Unkelos translate the pasuk? To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi. And I will say, if you notice, by the way, already the Gemara adopted Rabbi Yossi as we're going through the sugya. That chartsanim ultimately means grape seeds, and zog means grape skin, which I will say is also fascinating, the way the Torah describes the grape, right? How does the Torah describe the grape? How does the Torah describe the grape? From the inside out. From the inside out, which I will say is fascinating because, I don't know why intuitively you would assume that how would the Torah describe the grape? How would the Torah describe the grape? From the outside in. I will say perhaps there's an incredible Musar Haskell in this as well, which is interesting. So why does the Torah describe the grape from the outside, from the inside out? So I will say, if you think about it, by the way, it's such a contrast with Naziros, right? Listen to this idea. What's Naziros, I will say? What's Naziros? Naziros is a person adopting extreme behaviors in order to what? In order to go ahead and change the core, right? That's what's happening by Naziros, right? Haroa sota bekalkula. Someone sees something terrible occurring. What do? They adopt this extreme behavior. But what's the goal of extreme behavior? To shape the panemius of the individual. And by the way, this is in line, we mentioned this last night, the Chasidus Chabura. This is in line with the Sefer HaChinuch. Sometimes what you do is your behaviors have to shape how you feel. That's all what Nazir says. Nazir says behavioral modification in order to affect internal change. Now let's say perhaps like HaKadosh Baruch Hu was telling the Nazir in a nuanced fashion is, this is not really the right derech. What's the right derech? Mechartsonim ad zag. The real derech is change the way you think, and ultimately that will shape the way that you behave. Change should take effect from the inside and ultimately spread out from the grape seeds to the grape seeds. I will say, we did this last night. This is the derech of the Piazetzna. Right? The derech of the Piagetz, the B'nai Machshava Tova, is create and change the way that you think, change the way that you look at the world, change the way that you look at yourself. And ultimately, again, that will shape the way you behave. So I will say it's this incredible interface. So the Nazir, once again, the Nazir who adopts extreme external behavior in order to affect internal change, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives him this nuance message, Shefala, don't eat the grape, don't eat the grape. And by the way, how shouldn't you eat the grape? From the inside out. Mechatzanim ad zag. Because what you're doing, I understand why you're doing it, but that's not the best way. The best way is change yourself on the inside. Change the way you think. Change the way you look at the world. Change the way you look at yourself. And ultimately allow that change to shape ultimately the way you behave. An incredible nuanced message from the Ribbon Shalom. We'll say Mishnah. Stam Nazir Islamed Yom. Great case. Stam Nazir says 30 days. Okay, we've seen this many times before. Gilach, Shogilchu listim. I will say, so listen to this. Let's say the Nazir accidentally cut his hair, or for that matter, again, by the way, could be accidentally or intentionally, or he was shaved by listim. Okay, I would say, just understand, like, so we look at this out like it sounds like a hazing over here. I say, unfortunately, right, the Jew over time is one of the ways in which the Umos HaOlam ultimately again have exerted their negative influence on us is by shaving the payas of the Jew, by shaving the beard of the Jew, by shaving the head of the Jew. So the Ma'is again, so that he was shaved by listim. What's talacha? Soser lamed yom. So we'll say this is very important. So what do you lose? So what you lose is 30 days. 30 days. I will say, essentially what the Mishnah is teaching us is, in order to bring the final offerings of Nazirus, you have to have hair growth of at least 30 days. So if you cut your hair sometime during your Nazirus, right, intentionally, unintentionally, purposely, right, whatever it was, you did it, somebody else did it, Lemaisa, you cannot conclude your Nazirus unless, of course, you have 30 days of growth. Nazir, Shegilach ben Bezug ben Betar o Shesif Seif Kol Shu Chayiv. Similarly, a Nazir who cuts his hair, we'll say Zug are scissors, Tar is a razor, Sif Sufra will say means you pluck out hairs. You pluck out hairs by hand. Halacha l'maisa, you're chayiv. We'll say that is a violation. That is a violation, right? Because a Nazir is not permitted to remove hairs off his head, and therefore halacha l'maisa is going to be chayiv. Fine. So we'll say that's talacha. Now we'll say this is absolutely fascinating. Listen to this. Ibayilahu. Hi Mazia. Milatachas Shabi o Milael. Listen to this shaila. The Gemara says, when hair grows, does hair grow from the base or does hair grow from the tip? Right? We'll say this is the shaila. Right? In other words, we know hair grows longer. Where is the growth taking place from? Is it grow from the not the base? What do you call it? The pore, roots, follicles. No, but it's a hair follicle. The part where it's attached to the head. No, that's the root of the hair. I think it's a pore, no? Okay, whatever. Right? I'm sorry? Bottom and top. Good. That's a technical. Excellent. Good. Keep it easy. Good. Keep it easy. So does the hair grow from the bottom or the top? Good. Easy enough. So the Gemara says one of these interesting. Can you imagine like the guy who asked this in the Beis Medrash, right? So the Gemara says, Lemay nafkamina, right? Who cares? Now now watch this. So Lemay nafkamina, lenazir shegilchu listim. So listen to this. Let's say it's the case of the Mishnah. Let's say this guy's a Nazir, Reuven's a Nazir, and what happens? Someone came along and cut his hair. Someone cut Reuven's hair. But, now what's the but? They left, their hair is long enough that you could bend it over. Right? In other words, that you could take the hair and essentially the tip of the hair, could touch the base. So his hair was cut. Right? Obviously, his head wasn't shaved. His hair was cut, but the hair itself is still long enough that halacha l'maisa, the tip could touch the base. So what's the halacha? I will say. Well, watch this. Rabbi Nazirus. If you say ultimately again that hair grows from the bottom, then Rabbi Nazirus hashakle. Then ultimately, I will say that what ends up happening is that halacha l'maisa, that growth that took place during the Nazirus, that was removed. that was removed, and therefore again he would have to let his hair grow out again. Eli amrit mila'el Rabbi, but I will say at the end of the day, if you say that hair grows from the top, my da'akdish hakaim, then I will say that means that what the Nazir consecrated, because again I will say, what did the Nazir consecrate? His hair at the time of his neder ultimately is still intact. I will say, see, you hear the shaila. If you hold that ultimately, again, hair grows from the bottom, so then when they cut his hair, ultimately, again, they cut off the hair that was consecrated. But if you say that hair grows from the top, then that which he consecrated at the beginning of his Nazirus ultimately is still intact. To which the Gemara says, Tashma meha. So we'll say, let's analyze this from here. Very interesting, we'll say. So listen to this. Inva. We'll say, Inva is a knit. Right? Inva achaya dekaim beikva debensa. We'll say, if you notice, a live knit, right? A live knit always nestles itself at the base, right? At the bottom, at the root of the hair. Rabbi, if you say that hair grows from the bottom, then what should happen with the knit? Then ultimately, so we'll say, if hair grows from the bottom, then what? Then the knit ultimately should rise up, right? Should be elevated together with the hair growth. The fact that the knit nestles itself at the base and remains at the base would seem to indicate to us that where does hair grow from? Hair grows from the top, not from the bottom. To which the Gemara says, the olam milatachas Rabbi, not necessarily. Hair can still grow from the bottom. Va'agav chiyusei nachas va'azal inba. I'll say, but rather the knit itself chooses to constantly climb down the hair and nestle itself by the base. Okay, Tashma, we'll say another case. Inva mesa, a dead knit. So berisha debensa, ultimately finds itself, right? A dead knit could often be found at the top of the hair. Milael Rabbi, and if you hold that hair itself goes ahead and grows from the top, then beikva debensa bailamekam. Then ultimately, again, the knit should remain at the base. To which the Gemara says, no. Hasan nami mishum the less bechela sharuge shariga va'azil. So we'll say it's very interesting. The Gemara assumes the reason why the knit normally finds itself by the base is because it moves there. It chooses once the knit is dead. Ultimately, again, it falls, because remember again the assumption is that it's the top of the hair that is weighed down, and therefore Allah Chalamayisa, that's where the knit finds itself just by dint of gravity. Okay, Tashma. Shmuel says interesting case. Mi bluris the kushim. So we'll say there's an interesting case from the bluris of the kushim. And we'll say, what's the bluris of the kushim? If you take a quick look at the rush, so we'll say, so the rush is on the bottom, it's about 7 lines up from the bottom of the rush in the wide lines. Mi bluris shakushim. The rush's girsa is goyim. Heels the bloris is the goyim. So we'll say, so what is the bloris? Shemagdilim bloris l'shem avodas kacham. Now we'll say the bloris essentially was like a ponytail, but it was a unique kind of ponytail, because what would happen? They would shave their heads. And just leave like this ponytail. We'll say, you know where you could see this? It's a mafurish scene in the 10 Commandments, right? If you remember again, this is how the Egyptians looked in the 10 Commandments, right? They all had, which by the way, they must have taken, I don't know, maybe that was really Egyptian culture. I don't know if the Egyptians had bloris. But as I remember they had that, who was Pharaoh in that, Yul Brenner, right? Remember? I'm the only person here who watched the 10 Commandments. Right, okay, right? I saw it on a trip to Eretz Yisrael. It was right. So I'll say, so that's, right, that's bloris. That's bloris. So I'll say, so now listen to this. So he says, so now watch this. Now here's the chap. So they would shave the rest of their head, leave this patch of hair, and they would make a ponytail, essentially like a long ponytail from this piece of hair. Ubisov kliya kal fiarosh osim kesher kedei lios akliya kayamo kashem gedilim v'holchim rafa kesher samoch l'sear ve'ino mahadi kibitzchil. I will say, now watch this. So I want to bring the following raya. When the goyim would make this bloris, what happens? They'd shave the head, they'd grow out this hair, they would braid the hair very tightly. Now I will say, now what would happen over time? Something very interesting. The area of the hair attached to the head would become loose. And I will say, now what does that seem to indicate? That growth is occurring where? at the bottom, at the base of there, because what's ended up happening is the hair grows out. So the hair that's growing obviously is not in the braid, So it gets loose where the braid is attached to the head. That would seem to indicate that halacha l'maisa, ultimately again, hair growth takes place from the bottom. To which the Gemara says, no, necessarily. Hasam nami, aidi dikamta hi mishchiva rafia. To which the Gemara says, no. In reality, the reason why that gets loosened is because the Gentile sleeps on the braid. So as a result of sleeping on the braid, moving on the braid, that's why it gets loosened by the hair, by the base. But that's not necessarily a raya that growth takes place at the base of the hair and not at the top. Tashma, but I was still trying to prove this point. Tashma, miskarta derafi amra milatachas. So we'll say v'sanya v'sud kat savi savia dikinos. Well, this is actually very interesting. So the Gemara says a raya for this is meister behema. So what happens on meister behema? You take a sheep, right? We know we put them in the pen. Small opening, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Sheep number 10 comes out. What do you do with sheep number 10? Right, a little brush of paint. They will say, what happens to the wall that's painted? What happens to the wall that's painted? It becomes stiff and like, what's the word? Stiff, becomes stiff, and as a result of the paint, right? So we'll say what's interesting is, but if you go underneath that wool, you go into the wool of the sheep, so over time, the wool underneath the paint is very soft. It's very soft. So we'll say, what does it seem to indicate? That where does hair grow from? It goes from the base and not from the top. So I'll say that's the lashon over here. Misikra derafi amra milatachas. Right? Ultimately, again, even though the sheep is painted, derafi amra milatachas. Ultimately, again, the wool underneath it is soft, which would seem to paint a picture that wool, that hair grows from the base. V'tanya, v'sanya v'su kat savi sabya dikin. I'll say another example of this is when old men color their beards, right? What do you see? I'll say it's interesting. Right? Old men color their beards. What do you see? Chavron ikvi nemehon. They are white at the roots. They are white at the roots. In other words, sometimes when you dye your hair, old men dye their beards, right? You can always tell really that they're actually gray or actually white by looking at the roots. So I'll say, what does that tell you? I'm Lamed Testament base 39b. What does that tell you? Shema mina milatachas Rabbi Shmamina. So I'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that hair grows from the roots and not from the top. Incredible. Now, one second, we'll say. So let's go. How do we get into this entire discussion? Because again, remember again, what's the Mishnah's case? The Mishnah's case is a situation ultimately again of where somebody's cutting the hair of the Nazir, right? Someone's literally cutting his hair against his will or whatever, cutting his hair with his will, right? But lamaisa, but with his consent. But lamaisa again, the shaila was what happens if they cut his hair, but they left off enough to be able to bend the tip of the hair to the base. Now, so we're asking again, what's the status? So now we've established that halacha lamaisa, when you go ahead and hair grows from the base. So now let's circle back. But that's what you learned in the Brisa. Nazir shegel chuhu listim v'shayru beikadei lakov rosho li karo eno soser. So say, what did we learn? Watch this. What did we learn? A Nazir whose head was shaved by listim, or I should say his head was shaved. His hair was cut by listim. And now what happens? I will say, but they left over enough hair, right? Or I should say, they gave him a trim. Right? But the hair is still long enough that what can you do? You could bend the top of the hair to the bottom of the hair. What's the halacha? Eino soser. This does not go ahead and demolish or destroy the neder nezirus he has observed. But one second, it doesn't make sense. But I will say, one second, if you hold that hair grows from the base, then I will say, what should be the halacha? Listar. I will say, why? Because if hair grows to the base, I will say, then when they give him a trim, what have they done? They have taken away the hair that he was makdish at the time of his nazirus. So I will say, here's the whole chap. If you say that hair grows from the top, so here's something interesting. What does that tell you? What would that tell you? When he became a Nazir, what happens at the moment you become a Nazir? You're makdish the hair on your head. If hair grows from the top, even if they give him a little bit of a haircut, what's the good news? That the hair that he was makdish at the time that he took his neder nazirus is still intact. Okay, but now we're saying no, hair grows from the base. Well, if hair grows from the base, I will say, but pashtos, what that means is they removed the hair from his head that he was makdish at the time of his Nazirus, that he became a Nazir. And yet, the Brisa says that that trim does not go ahead and destroy his Nazirus. But why not? Why not? What's going on over here? Shabbos is very interesting. Kigon, shagilchu achar melos. Oh. I will say, what's the case of the Brisa? Fascinating. What's the case of the Brisa? When did they give him, when did the listim give him a forced haircut, Rabbosai? After the duration of his Nazirus had already come to an end. Wow. So let's just take a simple example over here. Reuven became a Nazir for 30 days. 30 days are now over. What happens? Now the listim give him a forced haircut. So now watch this. Umani, Rabbi Eliezer here. Both is Rabbi Eliezer. Because what does Rabbi Eliezer say? The Amar, Kol Achar Melos Zayin Sosa. Both say we've seen this position before. Rabbi Eliezer is of the opinion that halacha l'maisa, once you finish the duration of your Nazirus, if something happens, now by the way, the something could be a variety of things. The something could be either a Tuma, as we'll see in just a moment, or something could be a haircut. Once you've finished your Neder Nazirus, if something happens, the most you have to wait, or the most you have to observe is 7 days. 7 days. So therefore the Gemara is suggesting a brisa that says that if a Nazir had his hair cut by listim, but they left over enough to go ahead and bend over the hair from the tip to the base, that halacha l'maisa doesn't, it's not sosa the Nazirus. That's Rabbi Eliezer. And when is it taking place? After the conclusion of the Neder Nazirus. Rabbi Eliezer said if something happens after the Nazirus, all you have to do is observe 7 days. Now, where does he get this from? Shabbos says, so interestingly enough, fine, where does he get this from? So my time, Rabbi Eliezer, Yolif taglachas tara mitaglachas tuma. Shabbos says he learns out ultimately again the hair cutting of tara from the hair cutting of tuma. What does this mean? Ma taglachas tuma shiva, af taglachas tara shiva. Shabbos says, now watch this. Rabbi Eliezer says like this. So we'll say Rabbi Eliezer's paradigmatic case is in the case of Tumah. What was the case of Tumah? The Nazir finished his duration of his Nazirus. Right? So Reuben is going to be a Nazir for 30 days. He finishes the 30 days. Then Rabbi say, then what happens after the 30 days? He becomes Tameh. What does Rabbi Eliezer hold? It's not social the Nazirus. Rather, what does he have to? He has to observe 7 days. Rabbi say, Rabbi Eliezer's obligation to observe 7 days is not unique to Rabbi Eliezer. What are the 7 days? What are the 7 days? That's the 7 days of Tumah. In other words, that's the halacha. You have to observe 7 days, again with hazah, sprinkling on days 3 and 7. Rabbi Eliezer says the same way that halacha l'maisa, you have to observe 7 days for Tumah. You also observe 7 days for Tara. What's the example of Tara, Bosai? That's our case over here, where let's say again, Reuven is a Nazir, and what occurs? Somebody comes along and cuts his hair. And therefore, Allah he has to observe 7 days prior to going ahead and offering up his karbanos, which the Gemara says, Af taglachas Tara shiva, the kim luhu l'rabbanan. Bosai, if you take a quick look at the Rush is on the right-hand column, about 9 lines in. Af taglachas tara zayin im gilchu listim la'achar melos. If, let's say again, listim went ahead and shaved his head after the close of the Nazirus, kodim havas karbanos, before he brought his karbanos, masha taglachaso shiva yamim. He goes ahead and he waits to do his official hair cutting 7 days. V'kim luhu l'rabbanon, and the Rabbanon have established kol zayin yomin asya mazya. Chazal felt that I will say over the course of 7 days there's going to be enough hair growth that the hair will grow long enough to allow the tip to touch the base. So therefore, I will say very interesting. So halacha l'maisa, the Gemara is assuming over here that this entire thing is reflective of the view of Rabbi Eliezer, which we'll talk about halacha l'maisa, but a very important area. Rabbi Eliezer of the opinion, once you close out your neder nazir, so when we say close out, that means once you've observed the requisite time, and the only thing you have left is what? Is the offering of the karbanos. The most you could lose is 7 days. So if you become tameh, 7 days. Somebody cuts your hair, 7 days. But essentially, according to Rabbi Eliezer, is once you've observed the actual duration, that's locked in. The only thing that could happen is a delay as to when you're able to offer up you're concluding karbanos. Incredible. Rabbi says, again, we're going to see whether or not we passing that we halacha l'mais in just a little bit. When we see a little bit in Metzrim in the coming week. So Gemara says as follows: Nazir shegilach bein betar bein v'zol osher sisei kosher. Remember again, what else do we establish in the Mishnah when it comes to hair cutting? However you're cutting your hair, you are going to be chayiv. So whether it is scissors, razor, or plucking out hair by hand, you are going to be chayiv. Says the Gemara, Tanra Avana Tar. Right, Torah says razor. Right, the pasuk is Kol Yimei Neder Nizro Tar Lo Ya'avor Al Rosho. So we'll say that's the pasuk. All the days of his nazirus, a razor should not come upon his head. Ad Melos Hayom Shayaz fine. So we'll say so Torah just says so Tanra Avana Tar. Amy Elatar. I only know that a nazir can't use a razor. Talash Mirat Sifseif Kol Shuminayin. So we'll say how do I know talash? Which means literally again to pull out. Mire, so we'll say, if you look, by the way, at the Rush actually defines these terms. The Rush says, Talash, Mire to the Shiv Seif, because I will say, they all kind of sound synonymous. They all sound like a pulling out by hand. So the Rush says, Talash, Biad. So Talash means to pull out by hand. Mirat, Besam. So we'll say, Mirate, it refers to a hair removal with a depilatory. A cream of some sort, right? Shif Suf, Biad, Vevira Sar. So this is very interesting. So it seems to be, according to the Rush, talash means pulling out by hand, but not necessarily the entire hair. Maybe just part of the hair. Let me do the bookends. As opposed to shifsuf, which means pulling out the entire hair. Mirate refers to hair removal with a depilatory. Okay, fine. Point of view Rabbi say is, I only know, Torah only tells me about a razor. Tar. How do I know that even if halacha l'maisa, again, you remove the hair, full hair by hand, part of the hair by hand, remove hair with a depilatory, you're chayiv as well. Talmud Omer, the pasuk says, Kadosh yeh gadol pera se'arosho. So we'll say the pasuk says, Kadosh yeh, it will be sanctified, gadol pera se'arosho. Literally, again, the growth of his hair. So the fact that the growth of the hair is kaddish, the Gemara's understanding means what? Torah is telling me that you cannot remove that hair with anything. With anything. David Rabbi Yosher, we'll say these are Rabbi Yosher. So we'll say, so I just want to point out. So first drasha, and we'll say this is also one of these interesting drashas where once again, no one is arguing on the result, on the conclusion. What we're arguing about is how do we get there? So Rabbi Yosher says like this. Torah tells me Nazir can't use a razor. How do I know that Nazir can't use other forms of hair removal? Kadosh yeh gadol's per sa'arosho. The fact that the hair is consecrated, the hair is holy, that tells you you cannot remove it anyway. Fine. Rabbi Yosher. Rabbi Yonasan says, Tar, Pasik says razor, Ainli elatar. I only know razor. Mirate, talash, sifseif kol shu, potter. Wow, okay. Rabbi Yonasan says, Torah tells me, Tar, I only know that you can't use a razor, but if you go and you pull out a hair, right, I will say again, by hand, part of the hair, or the whole hair, depilatory, you're potter, because you didn't use a razor. I have a haksiv kadosh but the pasuk says, bless you, that the hair growth of a nazir should be kadosh. So I'll say, what does it mean? Lememra di'im gilach le betar koim alei ba'asei v'lo sasei. Rabbi say this is incredible. Rabbi Yonasan says, Rabbi Yonasan disagrees with Rabbi Yoshia. Rabbi Yonasan says, no, the only time you're chayiv for removing hair is when? If you do so with a razor. But if you use any other means of hair removal, you will not be chayiv. But the pasuk says, Kadosh yihya, Kadosh yeh gadol pera sa'arosho, that the hair should be sanctified, which seems to indicate that you're not allowed to remove it through any means. So Rabbi Yonasan will say, no, what that teaches me is that if a Nazir does remove hair, Rabbi will say he's in violation of both an asay and what? And a lo saseh. Or I should say, a lo saseh of tar lo yala arosho, and an asay, that's the last part of the pasuk. So I will say, so incredible. So just to see what's happening over here, fundamental machlokes, you have Rabbi Yoshia using the ultimate last part of the pasuk of gadol pera sa'arosho to teach me, or I should say, kadosh yihya, gadol pera sa'arosho to teach me that any form of hair removal is asar. And Rabbi Yonasan using that to teach me, the only type of hair removal that's asar midoraisa is what? razor. What does the last part of the pasuk come to teach me? Because that if you remove hair, you're not only in violation of an assay, of a los assay, but also of an assay. Rabbi Tanya, another brisa. Torah tells me razor. Amy elatar. I only know that you can't use a razor. Talash mirate. Sif safe kol shuminai. How do I know that even if halach lamaisa, you go ahead and you remove it by hand or with the depilatory, that you're going to be chayiv? Talmud lomar lo ya'avar al rosho. Pasuk says, Rabbi is very interesting. According to this brisa, tar teaches me the prohibition of a razor. The phrase lo ya'avar al rosho comes to teach me what? All other forms of hair removal. So if you're going to say that hair removal is usher with everything, so why do you even have to mention razor? Just leave off razor, I will say. Leave it off. Right? And what would I infer if the Torah didn't say anything about if the Torah didn't say razor? What would I infer about hair removal? That any form will be usher. And if indeed any form is usher, why even mention razor at all? Lefi shelo lamandu letaglacha sachrona shehe batar. So I will say, so listen to this, because halacha lemaisa is fascinating. I will say, remember again, by Nazirus, there is a shaving, right? What's the shaving? The shaving is at the end of the Nazirus, right? What gets shaved? What gets shaved? His head. And I will say, that shaving has to be done with a razor. How do I know that that shaving gets done with a razor? How do you know that? To which the Gemara essentially says, the way that I know that ultimately is how? Through tar. Through the fact that the Torah goes out of its way to go ahead and tell me that a Nazir cannot use a razor on his head, tells you that it's during Nazirus that a razor can come upon his head. But what? At the conclusion of the Nazirus, dafka, it is done by a razor. Dafka done by a razor. So I will say, again, I'm going to leave you off over here in the middle of the drasha. I'll just share with you a short vart on the parsha. So again, we're kind of leaving off middle of the drasha, but just to point out what we're leaving off with are these two dramatic ideas. Number one, this machlokes between Rabbi Yoshia and Rabbi Yonasan. Rabbi Yoshia saying all forms of hair removal are problematic. Rabbi Yonasan telling me that no, it's only a razor. And now this second brisa that actually seems to support Rabbi Yoshia, all forms of hair removal are asr. So why does the Torah single out razor? To tell me that ultimately, again, as razor is used at the end of the Nazirite process. So I will say, Emir Hashem to be continued tomorrow. Share with you just a short vart. So I will say that the Torah in the beginning of this week's parsha speaks about the obligation. V'atot tetzaves b'nei Yisrael, mamish opening pasuk of the parsha. V'atot tetzaves b'nei Yisrael v'yichoi lecha shemen zayis zoch Kasis lama la los ner tamid. Parachav Zayin pasuk Chav, chapter 27, verse 20. Mamish opening pasuk. Chash Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu, and now I want you to command Bnei Yisrael, and they will take for you shemen zayis zach. Right? They'll take for you again pure olive oil. Kasis. We'll say, what's kasis? Crushed, lama'ar, to give light, laha'alos ner tamid, to provide perpetual light. Shabbos say, remember the Torah over here is telling us, shemen zayis zach kasis lama'ar is actually a very important halachic precept, which is, what type of oil can you use for the menorah? Only virgin olive oil. What's the definition of virgin olive oil? The oil that comes out from the first press, from the first piece. That's the only thing you could use in the Beis HaMikdash. Shabbos say, there's a beautiful insight by the great tzaddik Moshe Leib of Sasov. And he says that in these words, kasis lamar. So, right, if you look at the lashon, is right. The lashon of the pasuk is shemen zayis zach. So pure olive oil, kasis lamar. Crush it in order to give light. So Moshe Leib of Sasov sees in that phrase kasis lamar, crush it to give light, an incredible musar haskell. As I'm going to read to you. He says, kasis acharei sheben adam mechases umechashesh es yitzrara. So I will say, what's my avodah in life? Says Moshe Leib of Sasov. What's my avodah? Kasis. I will say, what does kasis mean? I have to try to crush the Yetzer Hara. Right? I will say, all of us have desires, wants, and passions and proclivities in life. And I have to try, to whatever degree I can, to rein that in. Now, the truth is, there's also the concept, we've seen this in the Ramchal and Tzidkas HaTzadik, of channeling those things, right? Because again, the koach itself is a good koach. The koach is a good koach. But at the end of the day, that koach needs to be rechanneled. But I will say, before you can rechannel everything, right, the prerequisite to channeling is restraint. is restraint. So the Ramosh Leib of Sasov says kasis, to crush something, doesn't necessarily mean to obliterate it. It means to restrain it, to restrain. They will say, what happens after a person is able to exercise restraint in life? Kovish ta'avosav vergelim aroim. If I'm able to go ahead and literally rein in my taivas, rein in my wants, rein in my desires, exercise restraint in life. Do you know what the byproduct of restraint is? Says the Rebbe, lema'ar. The byproduct, right, the peiros of restraint is light. He says, lema'ar mesugalhu lehanos miziv arashchina. The byproduct ultimately of kasis, of restraint, ultimately is to receive the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. See, I will say, it's an interesting thing because sometimes we assume that the great light of Kiddusha ultimately is a function of positive dynamic activity in which we engage. And what the Rebbe is trying to highlight to us is that sometimes the greatest light is not from what you do, but the greatest light is to exercise restraint in the hardest areas of life. Whether it's restraint in what we do, in what we look at, restraint in what we say, restraint in how we interact. Kasis, if I work on myself and try to hold back on doing something that I so badly desire to do, if I live a life of kasis, ultimately, lama'ar, I will be zochem Yirtz Hashem to the beautiful light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I will say, good Shabbos.